Welcome to the Economist event. It's been a cracking event. So many people. If you'd have told me 20 years ago that we'd get this many people caring about supply chain emissions in one room or worrying about supply chain emissions in one room, I would have been amazed. So, absolutely fantastic. So, joined by a lovely panel here. We have got some fantastic diversity in this panel as well about backgrounds and experiences and so on. So, I think it's going to be pretty good, no pressure. We're going to have you involved. I absolutely demand this, okay? So, use Slido. If you haven't called it up, come on, join the 21st century, get it on there and give us your questions. We are going to hear from this panel, but I also want to hear from you. I want your questions, but I also want your pains, your comments, your thoughts. I'm sure there's as much expertise in the room as there is necessarily on the panel. So let's hear from you as well. So my name's Oliver Hurry. I've spent 20 years talking about supply chain emissions, and suddenly it's cool. It's great. I spent the last 3 years basically being a giant agony aunt on Scope 3. So I run a thing called the Scope 3 peer group, which is 1,006 people who have no idea what they're doing on Scope 3, but have been given the job in their business. And we've been meeting for 3 years, basically crying on each other's shoulder about how difficult it is, and everyone looking at each other going, has anybody got any ideas? But it's been quite a journey. We're starting to make progress. Check out scope3benchmark.com. That is the systematic program we're putting together to get best practice sharing across the world on Scope 3. So it should be, we're getting there. Anyway, so I'm going to introduce our speakers briefly, but I'm going to let them dive in and introduce themselves. It's one of those sessions you get at the conference when you're given the title. And first of all, I read Understanding Scope 3 Emissions, and I thought, with 40 minutes, we haven't got a chance. But the next bit was, is it about how to measure it rather than how to manage it? What a provocative title. I think we all know what the answer to that is, but we're still going to answer it, and we're going to pick that apart a little bit. So we'll do that very shortly. So, a bit of housekeeping. Obviously, do make sure you're using the Slido. We will come to questions. And once we finish this session, we've got a break, and then you're back in the main room for the main session as well, which is going to be a topic even bigger than Scope 3, I suspect. So there we go. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So we have Leah Nicholson from Terrascope. I'm getting to know Leah and her platform very well, and it's a platform with a very interesting philosophy, which is very rare these days. So I'm very excited to have Leah on the panel. David from Princes as well, someone who is in a supply chain and has his own supply chain and is experiencing Scope 3 from all directions, I suspect. And Gabrielle from BT, who, well, what Gabrielle doesn't know about Scope 3, just to put pressure on you, Gabrielle, isn't worth knowing. She's been doing this for a long time and knows her stuff. We're going to all come to you with the questions, I'm sure. So delighted to have you. Maybe we could start with you, Leah. And I think we should just tackle the question. Is it about just measuring it rather than just managing it?
I kind of want to say yes, just to see your response, but of course I think
rage
we know.
inside me is building. Yes.
As a measurement B2B SaaS carbon accounting platform, I can confidently say it's about both, and it's really kind of looking at the sequencing, right? So understanding your data and your emissions in order to, I wouldn't even just say manage it. It's about reducing it, right? And so I think we know that a lot of companies do struggle with Scope 3 measurement. I think around 90% aren't doing it, and when they do it, it's 40% error rates. But at the same time, even with those challenges, the companies that do measure Scope 3 do have a greater chance of actually reducing emissions. And so there is something about measure and improving data that is leading to greater action. And so that's where we come in, and I think a lot of the pain that you're talking about, we see the tech sector really being able to bring speed and accuracy to Scope 3 measurement. And so as a SaaS platform, the way we do that is using data science, machine learning to do kind of big data at scale. And it's been a fantastic journey. I think we've got clients in agriculture, in apparel, and technology, media, telco, and real estate. And we've started as a startup in Singapore. We've moved into Japan, into the EU, UK, and Australia. And so it's a space that's tremendously growing, and the use of technology to reduce those pain points, to get quicker to data and analytics and insight, and in that parallel process, taking every action that's possible to reduce emissions in that sequencing.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Well, platforms are crucial. And they are. We have to think about data. We have to think about technology. But yes, reductions as well as measurements. So David, you're part of obviously a retail supply chain. You have a supply chain yourself. What's your thoughts on that question? And as your measure?
Well, for me, it's clearly a bit of both. You can't do one without the other. You've got to start with the measurement. Otherwise, how do you then go about the next bit? So the measurement is critical as a company that's in its relative infancy in terms of our Scope 3 measurement. I think we're doing our second full go at it at the moment. It's interesting, it's fascinating, it's daunting, especially for food supply chains. Realizing how complicated your business can be is quite an eye-opener. Finding the things you didn't even know you did that were in your supply chain is an eye-opener. So that's quite a challenge just from a raw material point of view, if nothing else, before you get into staff travel and staff commuting and the full footprint and assets. So it's really critical to do that, but clearly that starts to identify, if you didn't know already, where your big hotspot's going to be. So that then leads you into the management, and that's something that's still very early days for us. It's going to rely, not completely, rely hugely in terms of supplier engagement. But we've got to focus in on as you would in most sort of projects, focusing on the big ticket items to start with, and try and focus in with perhaps your more mature and larger suppliers to discuss with. But in essence, measure it first and then start getting into the managing. The managing is the problem and difficult area between now and your end net zero target, be it 2040 or 2050 or wherever.
Indeed, and even though you're at the start of their journey, I think many in the audience are probably at the start. Frankly, everyone's at the start of their journey on Scope 3, so don't believe for 1 second anyone who claims they've cracked it, because they definitely haven't. And it all starts somewhere, and every Scope 3 conference or session we have, it's always about get started, start somewhere, and that's always the truth. The question is, what do you do? And I think hotspotting and understanding where you are is obviously critical. Gabriel, your business is quite different to these two, and I've been doing this, as I said, for a long time with an incredible strategy behind it. So your thoughts about that provocative question?
Yeah, no, as everyone said, I think it's about both, and just to set it in a bit of context. So when we look at BT's end-to-end carbon footprint, only 6% is from our own operations. 70% is from upstream supply chain, and 23% from customers using our products and services. So it's all Scope 3, right? Which is why we need to focus on this. I think we've been looking at our Scope 3 carbon footprint for about a decade now, and we report publicly on it. So, we engage with our supply chain and our customers, but in particular, we need to measure because we need to know how we're reducing and how we're doing. So we've reduced our supply chain carbon footprint by 28% since 2016-17. And if we didn't measure it, we wouldn't know if we were doing well or not. And I think another part of this is around public reporting, because we need people to start saying, well, how are you doing? How are you doing? We've been publishing our methodology on Scope 3 for over a decade. So everything that we do on Scope 3 is public. The way we think about it, our methodology, how we're doing. And we need more companies to do that, because otherwise we can't tackle those challenges together.
Yeah, and BT proactively looks at it as a value chain problem, don't you? You engage your customers to reduce their carbon footprint. You engage your suppliers to reduce their carbon footprint. And that kind of value chain perspective is, I think, certainly leading, would be the top of my Scope 3 benchmark in that respect. So I think that's good to see. Inevitably, I don't think it is a question of whether you manage it or measure it. I think that you have to do both, obviously, and if you're not doing it in parallel. It's more about how you measure it and how you manage it that I suspect most of the people in this room really want to know. Inevitably, when both of those things, we have to use the word collaboration. It's the law. It's a sustainability conference, but it is a critical part of measuring. And maybe, Gabriel, you could build upon that a little bit, because both for collecting data and for engaging suppliers, collaboration is key.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think about is, we don't want to go out to suppliers and ask different things as our sectors. So, working with CDP, for example, so we've been part of the CDP supply chain program since its inception, and for us, that's a repeatable platform, and that's how we can take real data on suppliers' carbon emissions reductions and put into our modeling. We also work together with our industry associations. So as a telco, for example, we are part of something called GSMA, which is an association for mobile companies. And as an organization, as GSMA, we go out to our suppliers and ask them as a collective to report into CDP. And I think going out there, not just as BT, because you can imagine a lot of our suppliers are a lot bigger than we are. People think BT is a big company, but in the scheme of things, we're actually not. So if I go out there not as BT, but as 20 telcos to say, what are you doing in terms of reducing your carbon emissions? That's a lot more impactful. We were one of the founding companies in 1.5 supply chain leaders. So if you don't know about 1.5 supply chain leaders, please Google it and please join us. Basically, we got together with Ericsson, Telia Group, IKEA, and Unilever to set up a platform really to share best practice on how you engage with global supply chains. And again, trying to spread the message, just not being one company, but being several companies going out with a similar message on carbon reduction and setting 1.5 degree targets. And you know, we now have a number of other organizations that have joined us, like Microsoft, MasterCard, and others. We also worked with the UK government, and I think working with government is key on this. The UK government has an amazing website around UK climate leadership, again, working with SMEs and, you know, how do we reach out to SMEs? So as BT, we have 16,000 suppliers. So I can't talk to all of them, unfortunately. So part of how we got together in 1.5 supply chain leaders was how do we reach out to SMEs as a collective? So we set up the SME Climate Hub in the UK. I worked with the UK government and really trying to encourage SMEs and giving them the tools, you know, where do you start on this journey? So hopefully those platforms have been of use to people and just, more around, you know, how do we get the data? How do we get people to start that journey and reporting on the data, and therefore we can take more action?
Yeah, good point. And just to absolutely emphasize, I know you've probably come here for tools and links. So the 1.5 Degrees Supply Chain Leaders Program is a fantastic program. It's businesses collaborating. Just want to emphasize your supplier engagement guide that has been collaboratively built by those companies. It's free to access, and it literally includes template engagement letters for suppliers. It's stuff you can literally download, copy and paste and steal with pride. It is absolute best practice, certainly in terms of collaboration. I'd highlight that. SME Climate Hub. If you're an SME yourself or you've got a supply chain of SMEs, SMEclimatehub.org is, again, a platform I was part of helping to build, and it is all about engaging suppliers, particularly SME companies in suppliers, and giving them the access to the free tools. I emphasize those tools. If you take those two things away, that's hopefully a little bit of gold dust. David, collaboration inevitably is crucial to you. You're in a very complex supply chain that's full of surprises, obviously, in that supply chain. But, of course, the retailers are your customers, and they are slowly getting their act together in terms of making your life a little bit easier in terms of that. And it is crucial that you collaborate with them, but they collaborate with themselves, I guess.
Absolutely, it's fundamental. So the you know, as an ambient grocery business primarily, we have other interests as well. So most of our sales go through, you know, a handful of large supermarkets in this and a few other countries. So they're absolutely critical to us, and they've really been setting the pace. I think it's phenomenally successful. I think they're ahead of governments in so many things, and they've been pushing that message down onto suppliers because they recognise, like you were saying in terms of Scope 3, Gabrielle, everyone's got the same problem. Their supply chain will be far bigger part of their footprint than their operations. Same for Princes, our supply chain dwarfs our factory emissions. So everyone's got that same problem, and it starts to cascade down. Retailers have been really good on this. So for a number of years, there have been, for a number of years now, there has been one particular platform in terms of our Scope 1 and 2 emissions that we enter data into, which is terrific, because prior to that, we would get 8, 9, 10 requests for the same information via a portal, via a spreadsheet, via whatever it might be. Now it's one job, emission sent. And they're starting to come together as well in terms of Scope 3, because obviously we're talking about an awful lot more data, an awful lot more complicated data. But if they take that same approach, as it looks like they're going to with an announcement recently working with RAP and with government, if we take that same approach, it will make life more simplistic for businesses. Because we are all still learning about this. I didn't know an awful lot about carbon emissions a couple of years ago. Thinking about joining your group. Do you want to make it 1007?
You're welcome, David.
Space open.
Your colleagues are part of it, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, you learn something every day about your business. Everyone is kind of grappling with this and getting used to it, and particularly in food. We're quite a complicated business. We have a number of very simple consumer products, and then a number of products that are far more complicated. If you think about it, a can of tomatoes, can of tuna, as opposed to soup in terms of ingredients, for example. So there's a lot of complication, but finding that collaboration with the retailers is really useful. It's so important for us as a business. And our industry will be massively diverse. We're a large company, not the largest. You've got your kind of upper tiers of the Unilevers and Nestle's of this world. But there'll be a huge number of suppliers going into the retailers that are much, much smaller, much more artisanal. They need to be part of this journey as well. Can't just be big corporations that supply all our food going forward. But that will cascade in time. I mean, the retailers at the moment are rightly focusing on the same as we're focusing on the big part of our chain. They'll be focusing on the big suppliers to them, but it will cascade down. But generally, the larger parts of the market will work together first, and then the smaller SMEs will come in. And that will follow, because it'll be very difficult for SMEs to start using data measurement platforms at the moment. So it will come in time, but collaboration is an overused word, whether it's in this environment or whether it's in the ethical trading space. But it's an accurate and important word nonetheless.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And as I said, if for any of those that are listening in that aren't part of a peer group, either with your peers or indeed engaging with your customers as a collaborative group, it's certainly worth recommending. I've got a Google Doc of 187 different sustainable procurement collaborations that are in the world right now, and a considerable number of them are on Scope 3. So there's everything from potatoes to aluminium to everything. There is something out there from almost all of you, I suspect. So go and look it up. But also, as I said, work out where your customers are collaborating for your B2B as well. It's pretty critical. So the best Scope 3 platforms think about this problem collaboratively, because suppliers shouldn't be sent a million different questionnaires and asked to fill in a million different things in a different way. So platforms are critical to be thinking about collaboration. So how do you guys do it? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we believe that we can use data science to get insights for companies sooner, and then do really targeted and kind of materiality-driven supplier engagement. So just to give a concrete example for that, and when we think about the data journey versus the emission reduction journey, on the data journey, we have the activity data and we have emissions factors, and our platform is built to ingest company activity data and use data science machine learning to find the best emissions factor. So we provide speed and accuracy to carbon inventory. So that's our kind of core capability. And just to give an example, so kind of Scope 3 Category 1 purchase goods and services is typically a very large source of emissions. And for one of our clients in Southeast Asia, looking at beverage industry, so didn't have much data from suppliers. So what we did was develop the methodology where you essentially, it's like a life cycle assessment for the product, so product carbon footprinting, where we decompose the bottle of beverage into different parts and then find the best match for each component part for the emissions factor. And so you're kind of building from the ground up, and when we checked about 700 SKUs, we were able to get within 92% accuracy when we compared it to real kind of supplier data. And so what that meant is we could, now having confidence in that methodology, we did about 5,000 SKUs for that client. And so that enabled much more accurate insights, and then the company can then decide, okay, well, I see this group is coming from, this is important product line for me as a business, and it's also an important hotspot. And so let's do like targeted kind of supplier data. So I think we see data science getting to that level of insights much faster and really doing kind of targeted collaboration. And one of the things that came out of this morning's opening remarks was we're now accounting in dollars and tons. And so for us, a really important principle is any of the data, how can we make that most relevant in a business context? And in our platform, that looks like anything from visualizing the organizational chart and having emissions based on these data science techniques kind of allocated to different business units. And so what are, kind of suppliers that match the organizational chart? So I would say that it starts looking at this data journey and the emissions reduction. It starts with doing a data journey that is driven with collaboration internally in order to engage with those important stakeholders externally. And so that's where we kind of fit into empowering companies through the platform.
Nice. Again, refreshing to hear technology companies talk about insights rather than data. The fixation with data in Scope 3 is utterly amazing. We are trying to make emissions go down very urgently. We're not trying to slowly, more accurately measure how bad everything is. Right? I mean, how long we have to talk about this, I don't know. So it is about reductions. GSK, who I'm part of my group and spend a lot of time with, they have a thing called no regret actions. Their procurement team do no regret actions. Don't have to measure them, don't have to report them, don't have to track whether they've been successful, because they're really, I was going to swear, really obvious things you should go and do. Ask your suppliers about science-based targets. Ask them if they do, looking at renewables. There's some really obvious things to do. So, yes, we need data, of course we do, but let's also get on with doing some stuff. So, 16 minutes left. Should we have a bit of a clinic? Oh, go. Gabrielle, please.
I just wanted to add to your point, Oliver, about, well, what are we actually doing? And I think for all of us in this room, it's using our purchasing power. So, as BT, we're a big purchaser. So how do we do that? So 15% of our adjudication criteria is related to human rights and sustainability. We now have a pre-boarding assessment with a question, do you have a net zero target? Do you focus on carbon reduction? And it's really working, because every time a supplier is onboarded and says no, the questionnaire comes back to me to write back to the supplier to say, hello, you, what are you doing? This is really important to us, and we want you to think about it, have a look at the SME Climate Hub, have a think about what you're doing. We're launching a new supplier engagement campaign on net zero. We did a webinar with CDP on it. We're saying, well, where are your net zero targets? What are you doing? This is how you can start on the journey. We also build a carbon reduction clause into some of our key contracts. So when a supplier signs a contract with BT, we basically say, as part of your contract obligation to BT, you need to reduce your carbon emissions over the term of the contract. And we do monitor that. And that, I think, has brought the conversation from me talking to sustainability team to actually buyers and executives talking about the importance of carbon reductions. So, I think there are some very concrete things that we can do as customers to our suppliers. And I think, as David said, just that whole cascade thing is so important. I will ask my key suppliers, but they need to ask their suppliers in turn.
Excellent. And just again, another tool for everyone to think about. I also chair the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is a global community of procurement professionals working on sustainability. And they've collaborated with a collaboration of lawyers. And if you ever heard of the Chancery Lane project, so Chancery Lane is in the tube stop. If you Google Chancery Lane project, it's literal cut and paste contract clauses for climate change that you can download, cut and paste, give to your procurement team and say that is best practice, and it's all free. So it is incredibly popular. So highly recommend looking at that. So, sorry, should we go into a bit of a clinic mode? Because there's loads of questions. So I think we'll fire some questions. Don't all have to answer, so I might choose one of you, but please pass it over. So, I have to go to 20 different platforms to report emissions to different clients. Reporting burden is untenable. How will that burden be addressed by industry? David? Can you?
Well, I could have a go. I'm very sorry. I share your pain a bit. Talk to your customers that are asking you. I'm lucky in some respect in that our customers that were a little bit like this a few years ago. It was lots of requests for the same stuff. They're quite forward thinking. They're very very acutely aware of this issue. So they came together. But I can't really speak for other industries. But I guess whoever asked it is in a different one. Plead your case. Plead your case. We are all in this together. I cannot do this. You've got to find a way through. If you have a representative trade body, I know it's a bit easier said than done. I don't know your industry. Lean on them. I know that in my industry, the Food and Drink Federation a few years ago, we're getting feedback from a lot of their members, people like me, saying, look, can you talk to the British Retail Consortium that the retailers are all part of, and tell them, look, this is problematic. They're all asking me the same thing, and they have come together. So I'm sorry, that's not a great answer, but just plead your case. If you want me to do this for you, help me, help you. Sorry, that's out of Jerry Maguire, isn't it? Help me, help you. But it's worth a go. It's something that's got to be done, because they're probably not quite aware of what they're asking you and what others are doing at the moment. And maybe it's an industry that doesn't talk to each other as much as it should, but they need to hear the feedback. So feed it back.
Lovely. Good advice. And as I said, I think pushing upwards and explaining that by giving having this situation, you have to hire people. You have to put more cost into your business to deal with all of this. Once they understand that, then they might change. I'm going to come to more questions because there's almost something for everyone here. So the more we get through, the better it'll be. Maybe one for you, Leah, we can pick up here. Measurement is important, but how granular do you really need to get to drive change? So between supplier footprint on one end and product on the other, how granular do you really need to be to drive change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you can start, I think it's not about getting to a certain level, it's about starting the process and improving over time and figuring out where you want to improve first. Within the kind of measurement, we have these management capabilities where you can start to do what-if simulations. And so, for example, like in that case, what if I were to switch out certain ingredients with 50% recycled material, and just seeing the emissions impact of tangible actions can be enough to spark a change in a procurement decision or some information like this. So I think it depends on what your business goals are. If your business goals are just to report to CDP, then we know that it's not a super high level of accuracy that you need to do that. If your goal is to drive strategic business decisions over time, then you want to know how accurate that data is and maybe kind of take decisions accordingly and look at that parallel data journey as well. I think there is an interesting trend, as David was talking about, transparency. As we start to get more transparency around where emissions factors are for different businesses or products, then that transparency is going to drive procurement decisions. And so the incentive in some ways is going to switch, where it's going to be the companies producing these goods will have the onus, right? I'm going to use your average emission factor unless I get one from you otherwise, and it's going to be at this. So if you're a company that's really investing in climate action and actually reducing emissions, then you want to show what your emissions factor is so that platforms like ours can start to track that actually you're a really progressive supplier. And so it's interesting to see some of the incentives changing around data transparency. In terms of the pain points around sharing, World Business Council and Sustainable Development is doing some really interesting work around standardizing that. And so, those key actors, we're here with standard accounting rules because of a lot of nonprofit organizations and other bodies, and they're working on this as well. So it's painful now, it's going to get easier. We have a whole ton of regulations coming in that are going to force a lot of solutions in this space. So to answer the question, just get started on the journey and try to look at your decarbonization, because you're at risk of being left behind if you're not at the front of the transition.
Yeah, good point. Just on that, again, another thing to Google, in terms of the product carbon footprinting, the PACT program, P-A-C-T, by the WBCSD, lots of acronyms, welcome to my world. PACT program is setting the standards for product carbon footprinting, and the industry initiatives that I'm working with are adopting them. Another really good example is the chemicals industry, who've come up with their product carbon footprinting guidelines. Chemicals is in everything, it's in all the value chains. Really take a look at their product carbon footprinting guidelines. They are setting the standard in the chemicals industry and have been written with the purpose of other industries using them. Gabrielle, I've got one for you. So, have you got a success story of changing the mindset of sections of your supply chain who may have become disengaged? How do you engage suppliers? How do you really get them engaged, particularly some of those tricky suppliers?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did, we set up something called the BT Better Future Supplier Forum. So that's when I came into my role about 13 years ago. So typically procurement had focus on quality and SLAs, and it was always quite a difficult conversation with our suppliers. And I thought we wanted to do something more around sustainability, but to be really about engagement and learning. So we also set up something called the BT Game Changing Challenge, which is our Dragon's Den. So we invite suppliers to come in and pitch new ideas around sustainability and new innovation. And they come into a panel of BT people, you know, someone like me, somebody from procurement, from the lines of business, from the people selling our stuff. And one of the innovations that came out of that, I don't know if you're a BT customer, hopefully you are, but you might remember our old broadband router, which we called number 3. It was a big boxy kind of thing, and it was in a very glossy kind of packaging with lots of colors and things. And we asked our suppliers, well, how can you innovate on that? And so our broadband router changed. So it's now a flat one. It's got spring out feet underneath it. And we did that so it could fit in a letterbox. So instead of customers maybe not being at home when you get your router delivered because the square box wouldn't fit in your letterbox, this new design fits in your letterbox. So that saves carbon from customers having to go to the post office and having missed it. We used to have a CD inside, and we had an instruction leaflet. How do you, start your router kind of thing? We got rid of all that. So the instructions are now on this, paper box. Everything is there. We got rid of several things just as part of challenging our suppliers. And I think that's really important, which has always kind of surprised me. I said, well, why didn't you think of this yourselves? Oh, well, we didn't. We don't think of these things unless you ask us. And I think, again, that's so important as a customer. You need to start asking the question of your suppliers and start challenging them to come up with innovation.
Absolutely, great advice. And again, on my Scope 3 benchmark, supplier engagement actually talks about innovation rather than just preaching at them about what you think they need to give you in terms of carbon data. Is absolutely right. BT's program on supplier engagement is one of the best. Another really good one is Solvay's, S-O-L-V-A-Y. If you Google that, their supplier engagement program involves them running competitions with their suppliers to say, bring us innovations that we can do. So yes, they get educated on carbon, but let's face it, suppliers want to win more business with that. It's a great way to engage suppliers. So yeah, I'd recommend that. 5 minutes left. How many more questions can we cram in? So forgive me, I think this is worth doing. To Princes, you ready, David? Good luck on this one.
Sounds like
please,
a game show.
please, could you share your thoughts on traceability and its relevance to Scope 3?
Well, as a food business, it's critical anyway from a food safety, authenticity, etc., which is never fun. There's issues in the food industry this week in terms of meats, which is something disappointing to see 10 years after Horsegate. From a Scope 3 point of view, well, I'm not sure if I'd thought of it through in terms of that lens, but for us in terms of traceability, there's so much in the food safety side, and also using a lot of blockchain, but using it from a human rights point of view rather than necessarily using it from a carbon point of view. So I'm not sure I can answer that, to be honest with you. It's clearly going to be critical for us to understand our chains in as much detail as we can, be that commodity from a country or the emissions of a particular supplier. So it will be important to have that level of identifiability to be able to say, okay, this commodity, this supplier is X 100,000 tonnes of carbon. We've got to get to that level in order to do anything about it. So through the technology, through the platform you use, you've got to be able to get to that level. Yeah.
It's about understanding it, isn't it? Well done. You did really well on that one. So maybe one for you, Leah. Have you got any examples of how data measurement and collaboration has drastically reduced Scope 3 emissions?
Drastically reduced.
Or just let's say reduced. Let me take the word drastically out just to be a bit helpful. So examples where data and collaboration has really helped reduce Scope 3 emissions.
Yeah, well, what I would say is you can reduce Scope 3 emissions even with what's under your own operational Scope 1 and 2. And an example around that is kind of thinking about a company that was doing manufacturing of some fast-moving consumer goods, and a big source of emissions was the plastic being purchased. And by redesigning the packaging, which was under the manufacturing control, which was a result of doing emissions inventory at a time that coincided with, right now it's a bit ad hoc, but I think we'll get to a point where it's strategic to do inventories during strategic business planning moments. So they were doing a kind of rethinking of some of the packaging, and it allowed redesigning with emissions impact in mind. And so what that meant is immediately you're eliminating your purchase of material inputs into your manufacturing processes, which from an emissions reduction, right, your mitigation hierarchy, that's the first thing you want to do is look at prevention of avoiding emissions, and then looking at efficiency and substituting energy, for example. And so that's, I think, one example where some emissions insight has led to immediate action around emissions. I would say that one-off actions are important, but to sustain the level of transformation that we need, right? So halving emissions by 2030, and in a context of where the world economy is growing by 40%. So what that means is huge transformation, and when you need transformation, you need strong kind of drivers of change, and data is reliably one of those. And so really planning ahead, not just using it for measurement yesterday, but thinking about where we're going and what we're gonna, some of those challenging decisions that businesses need to make over time. So even if it's not paying off right now, it's gonna get you there for sure.
Awesome. I'm very happy that you've given me so many questions here. We've got 2 minutes. Okay, coming to you, Gabrielle, with this one. How to influence big tech to get more transparent about the scope 3 of their clouds and their tech and their IT. Are they too big suppliers to influence? I get this a lot. How do we help leverage and engage those big tech companies?
Again, I guess I'll come back to, Oliver, I'll come back to collaboration.
It's always a safe bet.
And, you know, a bit of peer pressure, which is why I said in the beginning, you know, let's be public about what we're doing. Let's be transparent. So, yeah, it's all great to say, oh, I have a target to be net zero by next year. Okay, well, how are you going to get there? What are you doing? What's your progress? Some large companies are not reporting very transparently on this. So how do we put pressure on them to become more transparent? Whether that's through CDP, whether that's through regulation, whatever it is. But I think, you know, as all of us, let's just work together to put pressure on these companies. And as I said, through our trade associations, you know, we are trying to do that by getting together with other, with our peers to do that.
Superb. I always have another initiative, don't I? And I also run the Indirect Spend Alliance, which is about helping about 18 different global brands help their procurement teams in different indirect spend categories to collaborate on decarbonisation. And we are collaborating on the tech sector and actually engaging Microsoft and Salesforce to get them to tell us more about how to engage them. So that is something that is valuable. You do pay for that one, though, so just but I thought I'd add that one. Right, 7 seconds left, but I'm sure they'll allow us a little bit of leeway. Final piece of advice and nugget for the audience. So, Leah, people sat here wondering about Scope 3. What's your final short piece of advice for them?
It's going to come through regulations. It's going to be more mandatory in the future. I think we're seeing a huge amount of coming out this year. And so measure it if you haven't. And if you have, then continue to do the investments needed for accuracy and start acting.
Amen.
Right? Start acting right away.
David?
Engage your C-suite board, your senior leaders as soon as you can. This will change everything, in my view, in the long term. This is not just the sustainability departments. This will change your procurement. This will change the supply chains you source from. This will change your brand strategy. This will change your customers. Over the long term, start now.
Excellent. Almost feels like you said that many times. We will get there. It will happen.
At least people listened.
Gabrielle, finally to you.
No, just please help us cascade. I think we all individually or as companies have a role in this. Ask your suppliers, ask other people, what are they doing personally or within their business to reduce their carbon emissions? Because actually just asking the question and having the conversation makes a difference.
Absolutely. No one really knows what the hell they're doing on Scope 3. I can assure you of that, even if they pretend they do. Help each other, collaborate, share knowledge, get on with it. Don't make perfect be the enemy of good and all that sort of good stuff. So we do, underline do, have a 340 session in here next. It's a case study on the Hitachi rail, and then we miss out the paper ends. So hopefully that's useful. Thank you to my panel.